Today, I'm grateful to be joined by David Enrich to discuss his new book, put it up on the screen here for you, Murder the Truth, Fear, First Amendment, and the Secret Campaign to Protect the Powerful. David is a business investigations editor at the New York Times and the author of several other books, including Dark Towers and Inspired Enrich. David, thanks for taking the time to join me.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I just want to say first that the book was incredible. I found it to be an extremely extensive look into this kind of, like you call it, obscure field of libel law. I just want to kind of get your thoughts first. What was the experience like of researching and writing this book? Like, did you receive threats of intimidation? Was it really
Yeah.
difficult?
Yeah, I got some threats from lawyers kind of toward the tail end of the book project. And the overall experience though was really, I found really interesting and pretty positive. And I spend a lot of time around journalists at places like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and MSNBC and places like that. And I don't interact that often with journalists working either for smaller news outlets or who are just independent journalists. And
Mm,
and I did a ton of that for this book. And I got to talk to people from all over the country, in some cases all over the world, who have
mm,
had these just really harrowing experiences that um, put the relatively mild threats that I dealt with. It really put it in perspective that I sit in a pretty privileged position here. Right now in the New York Times newsroom, and there are few better places in the world to practice journalism. But I got a pretty good close up, high definition view of the much more kind of challenging environment facing a lot of journalists who are either on their own or work for
mm.
outlets that don't have the resources and the experience that the Times has.
Sure, yeah, and I thought it curious because if I recall correctly, you interviewed the son of the former Albanian prime minister.
Yep. Yeah.
That's and then I'm originally from Colorado as well, and so I go to school in
Oh,
Iowa.
okay.
So I saw all the different connections that you were writing about
Yeah,
in the
there's
book.
both Colorado and Iowa scenes. Where did you go to
Yeah, for
college?
plenty.
Or
I
sorry,
go to
where
Iowa
did you
State.
no, I sorry, I knew that. Where did you grow up in Colorado, Ivan?
I grew up in Denver, the metro
Oh,
area.
okay.
So I
Got it.
graduated from high school in Arvada. But yeah,
Got it.
I kind of grew up all over the place. And so, what motivated you to kind of first investigate this area of libel law? What are the
Yeah.
intellectual origins of the book?
Well, the origins, there are a couple of them. I mean, the first and foremost, I think, is that uh, I run a small team of investigative reporters at the Times, and I started really paying a lot of attention to this around like 2022 or so, because we were just every time we embarked on a project, we were facing this kind of barrage of legal threats and occasional lawsuits from rich
Mm,
and powerful people or organizations that we were writing about. And as I mentioned earlier, there's the Times is pretty well equipped to handle that, and we have, in addition to a lot of experience, we have a fantastic team of in-house lawyers, and
mm,
we're owned by a family that has, aside from the money, just the appetite and desire and commitment to doing this kind of stuff. But it really got me thinking, what would it be like to be on the receiving end of these threats and litigation if I did not work at the New York Times? And so I started making all these calls all over the
mm,
country and started hearing these horror stories. But one of the other things that kind of affected my view of this is that before I was at the New York Times, I worked at the Wall Street Journal, and I had in 2010 I moved to London with the Journal,
mm,
and I think a lot of American journalists, certainly myself included at the time, really take for granted the First Amendment and the protections that it affords to everyone, but most notably journalists. And so I got to London, and there is no First Amendment, and in fact, the libel laws there are just notoriously friendly for people who want to threaten or intimidate or sue journalists. And my colleagues, well, I was personally on the receiving end of quite a bit of that, and my colleagues were on the receiving end of quite a bit of that. And I saw firsthand how it can be very hard to practice journalism, or at least the type of journalism
mm.
I like to practice, when you are not only facing constant threats, but when those threats when they get traction, and when they have a court system and a legal system that is really conducive to those types of actions. Creates a really big chilling effect. So I got back from London and joined the New York Times shortly thereafter, and just started seeing these threats coming here in America. and I was struck by the similarities I was starting to see, and
Mhm.
so that really inspired me to dig into this a bit more.
Yeah, you mentioned in the book too that London has earned its name as the town called Sioux.
Yeah.
For people listening who might not be aware, why is that the case? How can American journalists be challenged in England?
Well, and first of all, a lot of journalists work in England, like so I was part of that. But
Okay.
basically these days, obviously, it used to be the case that most journalism or most publications were done like they're printed physically, and that
Mhm.
obviously is no longer the case primarily. And so, if I publish something with the New York Times or on Substack right now in New York,
Mm.
or you in Iowa, the odds are that it's readable in London or in China.
Okay.
Well, probably not China actually, but in many parts of the world, right? And so, if you are, say, a Russian oligarch who does not like what I wrote about him, the Russian oligarch can go to court in London, file a lawsuit against me with the claim that because it was my article was read in London, that has created grounds for him to sue me in the UK. And look, because thanks in part to kind of changes in the US laws in the past decade or so, that as long as I don't go to London, those damages are not going to be enforceable against me. I won't have to pay anything. But if I get on a plane and want to go to London, the moment I set foot in that country, I can be held liable for whatever the Russian oligarch has filed against me. And that is even though speaking theoretically, even though I have no connection to the UK and don't live there and didn't even really intend to publish there, and even if the oligarch has a just very tenuous connection to the UK, the libel laws there are set up in a way that makes it really easy to bring and win cases, which is
Mhm.
in very stark contrast to the system that we have in the US that creates much higher bars for people, for public figures and powerful people to sue or even threaten journalists here.
Yeah, and you mentioned that the plaintiff has to demonstrate that the defendant acted with actual malice.
Right.
And that is kind of the whole center of your book. It hinders on the 1964 Time Sullivan case. Would you be able to briefly outline why that case is so important?
Yeah, sure. So, um, I mean, the case in a nutshell went like this. In 1960, the New York Times ran a full page ad paid for by supporters of Martin Luther King. And the ad included like a lot of text about the offenses being perpetrated by Southern officials, like, as they kind of sought to preserve white supremacy in the South. And
Mhm.
uh, so the ad took particular aim at the Montgomery, Alabama Police Department, and the guy who was in charge of the police department, his name was L.B. Sullivan. And he was not named in the ad, but he still took umbrage at what had been written about the police department that he was responsible
Mhm.
for. And so he filed a lawsuit against the Times, and it went to court with a all white, kind of Confederate style jury, and which quickly returned a verdict in Sullivan's favor against the New York Times. And it was a $500,000 verdict, which maybe doesn't sound like a ton of money these days, but it was a huge amount of money at the time. And the New York Times reacted to that by pulling its reporters out of Alabama and discouraging
Mhm.
them from writing about institutional racism in the South because they feared that if they kept it up and kept writing about this stuff, they would just get sued over and over and over again. And in fact, that was the goal that L.B. Sullivan and many of his counterparts in the South, that was their goal. They wanted to use lawsuits to discourage national news outlets like the Times or like the big TV broadcasters from covering the civil rights movement. And so the Times appealed the case. It eventually made its way up to the Supreme Court in 1964. And the court's ruling, it basically overturned the jury's verdict in Alabama. And it found that in a democracy where we place a premium on free speech and we want journalists and others to be able to speak freely and criticize freely and investigate freely people who hold power in our society or our government or our economy, it's important that people have breathing room so that if in the course of criticizing someone powerful, you get a fact wrong by mistake, or you make an honest error, that does not subject you to ruinous liability. And so the court created this standard, which is known as actual malice, which is a bit of a misnomer because when I heard that phrase originally, I assumed that it meant that it's a question of whether whoever said the bad thing was like
Mhm.
intending to hurt someone or like didn't like that person, and that's not really what it is. It basically it's a legal standard that means that if you are a public figure or a public official, you need to prove not only that someone wrote something or said something about you that was false and that harmed your reputation, you also need to prove that whoever spoke or wrote that defamatory falsehood did so knowing that what they were saying was false, so in other words, lying, or acted with reckless disregard for the accuracy of what they were saying. So it was a deliberately high bar that the Supreme Court created there. And again, the goal was to give people and journalists and others the breathing room so that they could really interrogate and investigate powerful people without worrying that if that kind of a factual slip up would subject them to being sued into oblivion.
Yeah, and you kind of the whole goal of your book is to kind of outline why that's important in the modern day. Many people don't know what the Supreme Court, feels about this just on a daily basis, kind of. Uh, can you explain briefly the importance of Clarence Thomas and Neil Gorsuch, but particularly Clarence Thomas?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, the Sullivan. Just to back up a tiny bit, the Sullivan decision was handed down in 1964, and then there were a few subsequent cases that kind of cemented its status. But it really
Mhm.
like revolutionized journalism, and that it gave news outlets and reporters kind of free range to do big, ambitious accountability journalism and investigations. And so it's not a coincidence that you had Watergate shortly after the Sullivan decision. You had like big, powerful exposés of the Vietnam War, things like that.
Right.
And so for decades, there's this kind of very broad consensus on both the right and the left that the Sullivan precedent was really important because it protected not only mainstream media voices, it protected activists on the right, for example. It protected community news organizations. It protected everyone who wanted to have a voice in the affairs of their community or their country. And that consensus really began to shift with the arrival of Donald Trump on the scene. And Trump and a bunch of other lawyers and activists around the country started arguing that the Sullivan standard should be either overturned or narrowed so that it would be easier for people like Trump to be able to file and win lawsuits against news outlets. And this movement was kind of quietly building for a few years, but then in 2019, Justice Clarence Thomas issued an opinion on this kind of obscure case that I don't think very many people were paying great attention to. And the facts of the case aren't really that important because what Thomas wrote had like literally nothing to do with that particular case. But it was basically he issued an open invitation calling for people to bring defamation cases to the Supreme Court that could be used as a vehicle to overturn New York Times versus Sullivan. And I mean, I can go into kind of his rationale that he articulated if you care, but the bottom line is he argued that this was a bad decision back in 1964. It was a bad decision in 2019, and Clarence Thomas has plenty of critics, but he's also extremely influential in the
Mhm.
conservative kind of legal movement. And so this opinion that he issued in 2019, it set off a real chain reaction where you had other judges, lawyers, activists, lawmakers, and all over the country, kind of like it was a kind of call to action, a call to arms, and a lot of people got activated very quickly on this. And so over the next couple of years, there were the campaign to overturn Sullivan, or at least narrow it, really gained a lot of momentum, and that arguably culminated 2 years later in 2021 when Neil Gorsuch kind of jumped on this bandwagon and joined Thomas in calling for at least to reconsider Sullivan, if not overturn it outright. So we now have at least two presumptive votes on the Supreme Court to at least consider overturning Sullivan, which is it's a pretty extraordinary change from where things stood just like 10 or 15 years ago, where this was not only the law of the land, but it was widely agreed across the political spectrum that it was the case was rightly decided, and that press freedoms, as well as freedom of the speech more broadly, were really kind of central to our conception in America of what our democracy is, what the First Amendment is. And yeah, as I said, that consensus has really um, deteriorated recently.
Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, Thomas expressed support in 1991 for the protections that
Yeah,
Sullivan
that's right.
offers, correct?
Yeah,
And
that's right.
I find it interesting. I find it interesting too because you write that Neil Gorsuch and especially in his opinion just cited I think it was David Logan if I remember his name correctly the article that he wrote that just had a bunch of faulty assumptions and incorrect data. But what I found interesting was how the lawyers in the subsequent cases you described used Thomas and Gorsuch as like basically a citation for what they were doing, and that you describe it as a self-sustaining echo chambers of the conservative legal movement. Kind of just talk about the dangers of that in the present day.
Well, I just think, and so the backstory on this is that, as you said, this professor in Rhode Island wrote a law review article that, I mean, he would probably disagree with how I'm about to characterize it, but in my opinion, based on my analysis and my research, and it included some, as you said, very faulty assumptions. He also either misinterpreted or described in very poorly communicated ways some data that he was relying on that Neil Gorsuch then misinterpreted again and included inaccurate data in this widely read opinion that he wrote calling for Sullivan to be reconsidered. And that
Mm,
just like spread like wildfire through the conservative legal movement. And there it was a real echo chamber effect. And you had judges, you can just go like search now in court opinions about the state and federal levels across the country, and the number of times that Gorsuch's opinion in this particular case has been cited has exploded. The number of times that David Logan's original law review article has been cited has exploded. And these have kind of been, and they're not necessarily the single most important intellectual ammunition for this argument to overturn Sullivan and narrow press freedoms, but they're a really important part of it. And to me, it just illustrated the, I think there was just a lot of sloppiness involved, frankly, like where both on this professor's part and also on Gorsuch's part, and also on the part of people who are continuing to push arguments that if they paid a little more attention and dug in a little more deeply, would realize are just quite weak arguments built on this just a fundamental misreading of data, and
mhm,
are, again, this is my opinion, but they feel to me a lot more grounded in kind of an ideological complaint about media bias and also a desire to make it harder for journalists and other members of the public to write negative things or write investigations and to kind of bring sunlight to powerful people and institutions, and doesn't necessarily need to be like the president of the United States. It could be, and this
right.
is one of the things I saw over and over again in the reporting of this book, is that much more often than this being about the New York Times writing about the president or the Washington Post writing about the president, much more often it is like a local newspaper that is writing about their police department, or even just like a local citizen activist who's circulating a petition against a real estate development. And people like that and journalists like that are subject to these libel threats. And the only thing standing in the way of those lawsuits and threats being much more effective is the Sullivan decision. And of course, the lawyers who are bringing these cases and issuing these threats stand to benefit enormously just financially if it becomes
Mhm.
easier to bring and win those cases. So I think there's a lot of self-interest to play here.
Yeah, and you mentioned the journalist in the paper that got shut down in Iowa actually for writing about the
Yeah.
police officer, the Carroll Times Herald. I was reading yesterday too that actually, once again, just earlier this month, the Iowa House passed another resolution for an anti-SLAPP law, which, for anyone who doesn't know what that is, SLAPP is a strategic lawsuit against public participation. And I feel like the only way I can really describe it's like the most Orwellian thing I can think of for rich people to suppress the First Amendment. I mean, it's interesting. I kind of want to shift focus a little bit. You actually mentioned um, in your response just now that people kind of have this general complaint about like what might be considered legacy media, and the
Mm-hmm.
New York Times is included in that. And do you think these media conglomerates have any incentive to distort the truth? Or in other words, the people that complain, do you think they have good reason to complain?
Well, I think there's a bunch of different things I would say about that. So, and the answer to I think there's like maybe two or three questions in one there, and I think the answer to all of them is
Yeah.
yes. So, and that's
Yeah.
a no, and I think this is something that's really important to be talking about candidly and
Mhm.
transparently, especially for someone like me who is sitting inside the New York Times. And so, first of all, to take your, I think, last question first, which is, do the critics of the media have a point, kind of. Is that a fair
Yeah, that's
summation
fair.
of that
Yeah.
question? Yeah, I do. I think they do sometimes have a point. I think that both on look, we make mistakes. We're journalists. We're humans. We don't always get things right. We have biases, and sometimes those biases lead us to be come down too hard on someone or too soft on someone else, or to miss a story or to overplay a story. Um, and I think in general, and I'm not speaking about the New York Times, I'm talking about the media in general, but that obviously includes the Times. I think we're like tend to be very good at
Mhm.
correcting like factual inaccuracies. So if, like we get someone's name wrong or just misstate something, we're pretty good and pretty transparent usually about fixing that. What I think in general the media is less good at is owning and being transparent about how this happens when we get something kind of structurally wrong. Like maybe we're
Yep.
writing about a topic or going big on a topic that maybe we shouldn't be. Or maybe we like missed a big story or a series of stories because for whatever reason we like were blinded to it by something. And I think
Mhm.
in general, and I think people on the left have often or sometimes at least have valid critiques about that type of stuff, and I think people on the right sometimes have valid critiques about that type of stuff as well. So I don't think this is like, again, we're flawed and imperfect. We do the best we can, but we screw up sometimes. And I do not think that we do a good enough job in general of communicating clearly and candidly and kind of fulsomely about why those mistakes were made and what we're going to do to deal with them. I do think, for whatever it's worth, that internally, I mean, I can speak here very specifically about the New York Times. We take this stuff really seriously, and we tend to be, in my experience, pretty introspective and thoughtful
Mhm.
about when we have screwed things up, and we try to do better. We try to learn from our mistakes. But I think one of the challenges is that like we don't feel that comfortable often being public about that. And part of the reason for that, I think, is just like normal human defensiveness. But I think part of it is
Yeah.
also a tendency that we've seen, or I've seen at least, for people on whatever side of, this is often on the right, but sometimes on the left as well, to kind of weaponize it, any sign of weakness or admission of, uh, error, to kind of weaponize that
Yeah.
in a bad faith attack against us. So I think it's a little tricky. I mean, I also do think that, and I think this is maybe coming to the point of your first question of that
Yeah.
compound question, like that basically there are like very strong, powerful incentives, especially I've seen this on the right, but it's probably true on the left to a certain extent as well, for people to try to actively undercut our credit, like the credibility of the legacy media. I think that there is, and I think a big part of that is that, when you are aligned as an activist or a politician with a party or a leader or a goal that is relying on dishonesty or distortions or conspiracy theories to promote your cause or your agenda, you have a really powerful incentive to delegitimize and
Yeah.
weaken journalists or news organizations that are going to call you out on those distortions and refute your lies. And so I think a big part of this is that, and I think this is especially pronounced right now on the right wing, um,
Mhm.
is that this is an effort to really damage the legacy media, because the legacy media, as flawed as we sometimes are, generally does a better job than anyone else, I think, at at powerfully and clearly and impactfully refuting lies and distortions, and that sometimes poses a threat to agendas and goals that are predicated on lies and distortions.
Yeah, I think it's like you said, I think it's really crucial that someone who works at a publication like the New York Times can kind of just be transparent about that. Because from my experience living in somewhere like Iowa, where it's very conservative, there's kind of a lot of support, I guess, for the ideological attack on the protections of the First Amendment. Most people don't know about Sullivan, but I would just say for speech in general. And that kind of brings me to the Des Moines Register for the people in Iowa will find this
Well,
relevant.
can I just,
What?
Caleb, can I just
Yeah,
interrupt
of
for one
course.
second? And I'm happy to talk about Des Moines Register, but
No, you're
one
fine.
thing you just said that I think is like incumbent upon all journalists, whether it is me or you or anyone in between, is to point out to people who and to the public when they make that critique that they think the New York Times is liberally biased and we hate Donald Trump and like
Mhm.
therefore we don't deserve the legal protections of the Constitution. Like people, I don't. First of all, I do not agree with that characterization. But even if I did agree with the characterization, even if that characterization is true and fair and legitimate, it's kind of beside the point because the whole point of the First Amendment is to protect voices that you disagree with, right? And once you start chipping away at the protections of that someone enjoys, whether it's the New York Times or anyone else, that has very immediate ripple effects to everyone else. And so I think you've seen like this doesn't have anything to do with ideology or even about the media necessarily. Like there's the Sullivan decision and the First Amendment and freedom of the press apply just as much to a local activist in the middle of Iowa who's fighting over, I don't know, like a big like agribusiness conglomerate and is trying to campaign to have like, reduce their power than it does just as much as it applies to the New York Times. It applies just as much to right wing talk radio as it
Mhm.
does to like the mainstream media. And in fact, we've seen in places like Florida a real movement when politicians like Ron DeSantis have tried to crack down on the media and have tried to weaken the legal protections for the media. The thing that has gotten in the way of that typically is not an outcry from the likes of the New York Times or the Washington Post. It's an outcry from people like conservative talk radio shows and talk
Yeah.
radio hosts who have warned repeatedly that weakening those protections among the first to fall will be conservative voices. And so I think it's and I'm not saying you're making this mistake, but I just think it's incumbent upon journalists in general to be really pushing back strong against this narrative that these
Yeah.
protections are for the media or for the like legacy media or for anything else. These protections apply to everyone who wants to have any sort of voice in public affairs, and you can love or hate the media, and that's not it's just not really a relevant criteria. So anyway, sorry, I will get off my
No,
soapbox.
no, no, you're fine. It's very helpful, and I think that's why I kind of hold the First Amendment to be sacred in some sense because you're right, it does apply to everybody equally, and you demonstrate in your book how that kind of came back to bite Fox News, the wrong way, in their defamation suit Dominion. Um, would you describe yourself kind of as a First Amendment absolutist then?
I'm not sure I'm an absolutist on anything, but I definitely am like I believe deeply in the First Amendment, and I think the First
Sure.
Amendment is, and the first three words of my book are "I am biased," and I am. Like I've been a journalist my entire professional life, my entire adult life. I
Mhm.
believe deeply in like the way I think most journalists view their profession, which is that we speak truth to power. We try to hold people and organizations accountable and we try to inform the public with the truth. And obviously, we do not always get that right, but I think that is the rights that the First Amendment protects are as close to sacrosanct from my perspective as any other rights. And I think it's really important. And look, I also think it's really important for people on the left and or on the right to be just respectful of voices from their opposing viewpoints because that is something that again, the First Amendment applies to everyone, not just the voices you agree with. In fact, it's supposed to protect even more the voices you disagree
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And so kind of circling back to the Des Moines Register case, and I'm going to also bring up the CBS and ABC lawsuits that Trump has filed. I just think they're relevant given kind of the current nature of them.
with.
But what are your thoughts generally on those three lawsuits? And I know that's kind of open-ended, so just take it where you want.
Well, I think all three lawsuits are. I mean, all these are all lawsuits brought by Trump using against news outlets that he perceives as having written or published critical things or unfavorable things about him. And I think in general, all three of these lawsuits can be seen uh, as really an effort by Trump and the White House and his allies to punish and to punish news outlets that have said critical things about him, but more than that, to send a signal to other journalists and other media organizations that they might be next in line for similar litigation. Um, and look, in the case of ABC and CBS, there are indications that those threats have worked, right? And there's ABC and its parent company, Disney. agreed to pay
Mhm.
$16 million to settle what most First Amendment lawyers, I think, regard as a very weak case against ABC. Um, in the CBS, so the CBS lawsuit is so the ABC case was alleging that ABC, and in particular its anchor George Stephanopoulos, had defamed Trump by misstating what he had been found liable for in a jury trial. And again, most First Amendment experts you talk to would say that the argument Trump was making was pretty weak. In the CBS case, it's a totally different situation. It involves an interview that 60 Minutes did with Kamala Harris during the presidential campaign, and Trump's side and other conservatives have alleged that the interview was edited in a deceptive manner in an effort to aid Kamala Harris's campaign, and that in doing that, CBS violated state consumer protection laws that are supposed to protect against things like deceptive advertising. And this case, I feel much more comfortable just saying flat out that it's garbage. Like and I say that for two reasons. One is that uh, we now have the full unedited transcript and video footage of Kamala Harris's entire answer, which you can then compare. You can see how they edited it exactly, and it just simply unequivocally was not deceptively edited. It's not. This isn't like he said, she said, or depends on who you ask. It wasn't. It was edited in a totally reasonable, normal manner that did not. It did not make her sound better than she normally sounds. It didn't make her sound worse. It was just a neutral, clean, clear edit. That's just the truth. And aside from that, like the legal argument that Trump's side is making and using these state consumer protection laws in this way are, they're just very unproven. They do not have a track record that they have not won in court, like using this type of argument elsewhere. And I think most people would agree. Trump's side would not agree with this, but I think most neutral observers would agree that this is a very aggressive and kind of envelope pushing interpretation of the law that they're using. And the Des Moines Register case is similar. I mean, that involves, as I know you know this, but a bad poll that the Des Moines Register and its pollster Ann Selzer published before the election, and the poll was wrong. And the question is, was that done with the intent and the effect of deceiving subscribers to the Des Moines Register or hurting politicians like Donald Trump? Uh, and I don't know the truth here because, I don't have any particular insight into what makes anyone tick. But and I have not seen any documents or anything like that. But Ann Seltzer has a very good reputation. There's no evidence that has been presented in public that I'm aware of, and certainly not in Trump's lawsuit, that is anything remotely resembling proof or evidence that they deliberately distorted the poll. They got it wrong. They acknowledge they got it wrong, and that is clearly meant. That is clearly falls under what the First Amendment is designed to protect. But we'll see. I mean, I guess it's not inconceivable that if that case goes into the discovery process, that evidence will emerge that they deliberately did try to get the poll wrong to hurt Donald Trump. I would wager large sums of money against that being the case, but I guess I cannot definitively say that's impossible. The way I can say with CBS that interview with Harris was not deceptively edited.
Yeah, I mean, in my reading, I wrote a column for the election when that poll came out, and it didn't convince me. It didn't convince many people in Iowa. I didn't think that it was going to have any meaningful effect once the actual election came around.
Well,
And
in Trump, and look,
Trump is,
Trump carried the state by what, 7 or 8 points, right?
I think
Or
he actually won by 13. I think he won by 13.
yeah,
Yeah,
maybe it was
I
the
could be
poll
wrong.
that showed him down. No, I think you're right. In any case, he won by a wide margin. So it's like
Yeah.
proving that you were actually harmed by that is, I don't know, like an uphill battle, to put it mildly. And again, I think Trump's side and people allied with him have tried to present a case in a separate lawsuit that basically
Mhm.
alleges the same thing, but the plaintiff in the lawsuit is not Trump or other Republicans.
Yeah.
It's subscribers to the Des Moines Register who are claiming that they were fooled by this. But it's like, I don't know. The polls are not absolute predictors of reality. And I think there is or should be a widespread understanding among anyone who is reading a poll and paying attention to a poll that it's a guess. Essentially, it's a
Right.
well-educated guess, and it's got some science behind it, but it's not ironclad.
No, and they're alleging that Seltzer and Des Moines Register violated the Iowa Consumer Fraud Act, which regulates like merchandising and selling, and then that they committed brazen election interference, which I think is bogus. But um, you've mentioned this in your book, and I've seen you mention it in some of your other interviews too, that you sit in a position of privilege at the New York Times because you're lawyers, things like that.
Yep.
Also, your publisher as well.
Yep.
Um, how can people, especially like, I work for a student-run publication. I have a personal Substack. Many people do nowadays too.
Yep.
How can we possibly challenge these people or fight back against these movements who try to take away these protections?
That's a very good question, and I don't have a very good answer, I'm afraid. I mean, I think that look, I mean, I think there's kind of two ways to look at that, and one is just in your daily life as a journalist, or in the daily life of other journalists who are either student journalists or have Substacks or podcasts or YouTube channels or whatever. And look, there's an explosion of people doing that right now. And I think there's
Yeah,
lots of tears shed at the national level about the disappearance of local news media and local newspapers. But this is kind of, I don't know if it's a silver lining, but it's like something that it's a ray of sunshine that there are all these new voices emerging. And I think that I'm not sure it fully makes up for the disappearance of local newspapers at all, but it definitely is helpful. And yet, as your question just kind of implied, it's people like that that are most vulnerable
right.
to legal threats and legal attacks. And I mean, so with the caveat that it is like very hard for me to, well, I realize the like kind of slight hypocrisy of what I'm about to say, but I think it's just kind of incumbent upon people like you and other people on Substack or other independent journalists to really like stand up for yourselves. And I recognize that that's hard, and I also recognize that sometimes it's basically impossible. I mean, there's a story in the book about this guy named Scott Stedman, who was
Yeah.
essentially an independent blogger in California he was just basically straight out of college and had no formal journalism training, but had really good kind of investigative skills. In part, they picked up from his dad, who was a cop in LA. And Stedman started investigating like these Russian oligarchs and their enablers, and started publishing on, I don't know if it was Substack or like WordPress or something, but uh, his stuff started getting picked up and it was in the media, and he started getting a lot of subscribers and followers. And he, as a result of that, started getting very negative attention from some very powerful and wealthy people who started to threaten him, and in one case sued him. Uh, and Stedman, by the way, is not someone who I've like always seen eye to eye on. We've clashed over the years on a variety of things, but he did his best to stand up to this pressure campaign, and he spent years fighting this in court. He testified before Congress at one point, and ultimately, like it just became too much for him. And Scott is like an extremely stubborn guy, and I say that in the best way. And eventually, this just like grinded him down too much, and he was not wasted, but he was depleting his limited financial resources on legal bills. But which is a big part of the problem. But the bigger part of the problem is that just psychologically, this was really hard for him. And he ultimately was like, at one point, checked into a hospital because he was having these
Wow.
debilitating panic attacks. And that's Stedman was like pretty candid at various points in talking to me about this, I think to his credit. But I think I've heard a lot about that from other journalists who have not been comfortable being public about kind of the mental health toll this takes, but it can often be really severe. And all of this is a way of saying that like it's very easy for me sitting where I'm sitting to say you should stand up and fight and don't back down. I recognize that that's like hard, and uh, I think one thing people can do is kind of band together and support one another. And so I think it's really important when journalists see other journalists under attack, that they speak up for those journalists, even if you don't necessarily always like what that journalist is producing, or you don't always agree with them, or maybe you have a different kind of political view than they do.
Mhm.
I think these are kind of matters of principle that, and this is something that I personally like think about a bunch. Like, what can I, sitting at the New York Times, do to support journalists who are under these attacks? And the most obvious thing I can do, sitting where I sit, is write about it and talk about it. And and I think that applies on a local level and an independent level as well. And there's this army of people now who have Substack newsletters or other things like podcasts and YouTube channels that are in some cases have a lot of followers, and speak up about it. Like when you see or when someone sees another journalist or just anyone else like who's exercising their rights of free speech and is getting punished for it, people should speak up about that. Again, even when, maybe especially when you disagree with that person's point of view, because again, this isn't about kind of enforcing or supporting ideological viewpoints. It's about supporting everyone's right to speak freely and say things that are critical of powerful people without having just like a butcher's knife like hanging over our head.
Mm. I think that's very important. And I think your book too is actually extremely relevant. And that kind of leads me to my last question for you. With Trump in office now, and we're just at the beginning of his term, do you expect that more cases kind of on maybe that aren't under people's radar will kind of arise and then eventually make its way to the Supreme Court to challenge Sullivan while Trump is in office?
Um, well, I definitely think there will be more cases challenging Sullivan. There
Yeah.
already are quite a few kind of making their way through federal and state court systems that are either designed to challenge Sullivan or have that as kind of like an added feature. The question is whether the Supreme Court accepts one of those cases, and if so, what it looks like. You need at least 4 votes on the Supreme Court to accept a case for review. Obviously, 5 to actually reach a majority. And I don't know if there are 4 votes to accept a case that is seeking to overturn Sullivan. And there's obviously Gorsuch and Thomas. There are a couple other justices who I could kind of see go either way, maybe. I think a more likely outcome in the next few years is probably that there is a case with slightly less ambitious aims, so that maybe could get accepted, like maybe something that's trying to kind of narrow the group of people who have to meet this high actual malice standard in order to bring lawsuits. So in other words, like, obviously elected officials need to be able to prove actual malice to win. So do public figures. And the group of public figures to whom this standard applies is fairly large. And it would not surprise me terribly to see the Supreme Court can at least consider narrowing that group. And that sounds like really technical and kind of like in the weeds, but I actually think it's really important because a lot of this is not just about, as I've said 15 times now, so I'm sorry for repeating myself, but it's not just about the
No,
New
you're
York
fine.
Times' ability to investigate Donald Trump. This is about like a local reporter in a small town in Iowa or Colorado being able to, investigate a real estate development or a police department or things like that, or about just like a normal citizen being able to speak up at a community meeting about something that's controversial and maybe criticize someone who they disagree with. It's about being able to circulate an online petition that is critical of a business in your town. It's about your ability to write a negative restaurant review on Yelp without worrying that if you get a fact wrong,
Mhm.
the restaurant owner is going to sue you. So and those are all things that could be jeopardized if we narrow the scope of Sullivan. And there are things that we're already seeing happening all over the country, and that's with the very strong legal and constitutional protections we have. So to the extent that those protections get diluted or
Mm.
or eliminated, I think we're going to see a much kind of darker era of threats to free speech.
Well, actually, something that popped in my head, just briefly.
Sure.
With that kind of threat to free speech from the Trump administration, what is your view on the recent detention of pro-Palestinian demonstrators that are students, foreign
I
students?
mean, I think that this is the attacks on free speech and free press are like part of a much broader attack that the Trump administration is waging against lots of different parts of civic society. And so it is, I don't know the specifics of all of the cases of people being picked up off the streets, but like as a general matter, like having masked men grabbing students or anyone else off of streets because of things they've written or said, and then locking them up in Louisiana or deporting them is just grossly inconsistent with my conception of what is allowed under the First Amendment and just like what our Constitution and Bill of Rights guarantees from a due process standpoint. This is part of something much broader, though, right? Like, there's at the same time they're doing that. and again, it shouldn't matter that these are protesters who have like opposed the war in Gaza. It should be
Absolutely.
no different than if these are student protesters who are like supporting Israel, right? Or any other
Absolutely.
matter. It's not about the substance of what they're saying, or it shouldn't be anyway. And obviously, clearly, it is in these particular cases about very much about what they're saying. But this is the same thing that we're seeing, or different versions of what we're seeing with Trump's attacks on universities like Columbia, and it sounds like Harvard, Princeton, and I'm sure there's going to be a long, long list of these. It's the same thing that we're seeing with Trump's executive orders against major law firms who have either employed people that Trump doesn't like, or have taken cases that are opposed to his administration. And again, it's the same thing that we've seen with the media, with Voice of America. Um, the list kind of goes on, and I think it's very hard for me to see this in any context other than that this is a pretty broad, wide-ranging attack on people and institutions who are criticizing or kind of trying to hold the president's power in check. And again, that is not how I conceive of or have been kind of like taught to understand what the Bill of Rights protects. We're not supposed to have a government doing stuff like that. And yet here we are.
Yeah, absolutely. And to my understanding, none of those people have been charged with crimes. I think maybe Mahmoud Khalil was, they said that he lied on his visa application, but I think that's all sort of still in the process of litigation. Well, yeah, that's all I have for you. I really appreciate you taking the time to meet with me today. Really
No,
interesting.
it's
And
my
I encourage everyone to read this book. It's extremely relevant, and I think for especially on campus for people who know me and students who engage with my work, if we care about journalism in this country, if we care about free speech, your book is essential. So thank you once again.
no, thanks for having me. It's nice talking to you.
Yeah, yeah, you too. Bye.